Daniel Cutler watched through the frosted window as his neighbor stumbled and collapsed 15 feet from the barn door, swallowed by the whiteout in seconds. By the time the wind died enough to recover the body 3 days later, Daniel had already begun digging. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The year was 1876. Dakota Territory stretched cold and unforgiving across the northern plains, and men who came to claim land under the Homestead Act learned quickly that survival demanded more than optimism and hard work. Winter killed settlers with brutal efficiency, and February was the cruelest month of all. Daniel Cutler had survived 3 winters on his claim. He was 28 years old, originally from Ohio, and he had partnered with Matthew Carver to work adjacent quarter sections 8 miles south of what would eventually become the town of Yankton. The arrangement worked well. Matthew was 42, experienced with livestock, and possessed the steady temperament that frontier life required. Daniel handled the crops and maintenance. Together they had built 2 cabins, a shared barn, and a well that served both properties. February 14th arrived with deceptive calm. The morning temperature held at 15 degrees above zero, no wind, clear sky. Matthew left Daniel's cabin after breakfast to return to his own place and feed his cattle. The barn sat 40 yards from Daniel's cabin, 20 yards from Matthew's, standard distance, nothing unusual. The storm arrived with no warning at midday. One moment Daniel was splitting firewood behind his cabin. The next moment the wind hit like a physical blow, and snow filled the air so completely that he couldn't see his own hands. He stumbled to his cabin door, got inside, and looked out the window toward the barn. Nothing visible, just white chaos. Matthew had been in the barn. Daniel knew that. He had seen him go in an hour earlier. The question was whether Matthew would be smart enough to stay there until the storm passed, or foolish enough to try returning to his cabin. Daniel waited by the window. The wind howled. Snow piled against the cabin walls with terrifying speed. Temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. The glass frosted over despite the fire burning in his stove. Then he saw movement. A dark shape stumbling through the white. Matthew, trying to reach his cabin. The barn door was 40 yards behind him. His cabin door was 60 yards ahead. He was walking blind into the storm's full force. Daniel grabbed his coat and opened his door. The wind tore it from his hands and slammed it against the cabin wall. He stepped outside and immediately lost all sense of direction. The cold burned his lungs, snow pelted his face. He couldn't see Matthew anymore, couldn't see his own cabin, even though he was standing right beside it. He grabbed the door frame and pulled himself back inside. His hands were already numb. He had been outside for less than 30 seconds. Through the frosted window, he saw Matthew's shape one more time, 15 feet from the barn door, walking in the wrong direction. Then the shape fell and disappeared into the white. Daniel stood at the window for 3 hours. The storm didn't stop. Matthew never reappeared. The storm lasted 3 days. Wind speeds that made stepping outside suicidal. Snow accumulation that buried fences and drifted 10 feet high against any vertical surface. Temperature that dropped to 30 below zero on the second night. Daniel kept his fire burning and waited. He had enough firewood inside for 5 days. Enough food for 2 weeks. Enough water for 3 days if he was careful. But he couldn't reach Matthew, couldn't reach the barn, couldn't reach anything beyond his 4 cabin walls. On the 3rd day, the wind finally died. Daniel opened his door to a cabin to his nurse, transformed landscape. Snow everywhere, sculpted into drifts and ridges that bore no resemblance to the flat prairie he knew. He waded through waist-deep snow toward where he had last seen Matthew fall. He found the body 22 feet from the barn door. Matthew had been walking parallel to the barn, not toward it. In zero visibility, he had become disoriented and walked into open prairie. He had collapsed from exposure and cold. Death had probably come within 10 minutes. Daniel and William Kendrick, their nearest neighbor a half-mile west, buried Matthew 4 days later when the ground thawed enough to dig. Shallow grave, wooden marker, brief words. Matthew had no family. His claim would revert to the territorial government. Daniel returned to his cabin and couldn't stop thinking about the distance. 22 feet from the barn door. 40 yards from his own cabin. Matthew had been surrounded by shelter and had died in the open because he couldn't find it. Over the next two weeks, Daniel learned he wasn't alone in his loss. The storm had killed 3 other settlers within 10 miles. All the same pattern, short distances, men trying to reach barns or wells or woodpiles. Distances they could walk in 30 seconds during normal weather. Distances that became death traps in whiteout conditions. He talked to William Kendrick about it one afternoon in late February. William was 55, originally from Pennsylvania, and had survived 7 Dakota winters. He accepted the danger philosophically. "Winter kills people," William said. "Always has. You stay inside during storms. That's the rule." Matthew broke the rule. He was trying to reach his cabin, Daniel said. 20 yards. He should have made it. Should have stayed in the barn for 3 days with no food or water. William shrugged. Better than dying 20 feet from the door. But Daniel couldn't accept it. The problem wasn't the distance. The problem was visibility and exposure. In clear weather, 40 yards was nothing. In a blizzard, 40 yards became an impossible maze. Wind disoriented you. Cold killed you. Snow blinded you. And you died within sight of safety because you couldn't see the door. He visited other homesteaders, asked about winter deaths, heard the same stories repeated. Someone froze trying to reach the well. Someone died walking from house to barn. Someone collapsed 20 feet from their own door because they couldn't see it through the snow. Everyone accepted it. Cost of frontier winter. Price of homesteading. Nothing to be done. Daniel couldn't accept it. There had to be a solution, some way to move between structures without surface exposure. Some method that eliminated visibility and exposure problems simultaneously. He didn't know what it was yet, but he couldn't stop thinking about it. Spring arrived in late March. The snow melted slowly, revealing the winter's architecture. Daniel walked his property and studied what remained. The drifts had been massive. 8 feet deep against his cabin's north wall, 10 feet in the low area between cabin and barn, 6 feet across most of the open ground. He studied how the snow had compacted over the winter months. The top layers were loose and granular, but beneath, where weeks of accumulation had compressed under its own weight, the snow was dense. Almost solid. He could walk on it without breaking through. He pushed a shovel blade into a drift and found the lower layers resisted like packed earth. The observation stuck with him through April and into May as he prepared his fields for planting. He had spent 2 years in Colorado Territory before coming to Dakota, working briefly in a silver mine outside Leadville. He remembered the tunnels, shored timber frameworks, passages carved through rock and earth, men moving underground, protected from weather, and collapsed by proper engineering. The idea came to him one evening in early May, while watching the sunset. What if you tunneled through the snow instead of walking over it? Not through the ground, through the snow itself, using the winter's accumulation as material to work with rather than obstacle to overcome. Carving passages through the compacted drifts. Creating protected routes between structures that eliminated surface exposure entirely. The idea sounded insane even to him. Snow wasn't permanent. It melted. It shifted. But the more he thought about it, the more the concept made sense. Winter snow in Dakota Territory didn't melt and refreeze constantly like it did in milder climates. It fell and stayed. Accumulated in massive drifts that remained stable for months. Compressed under its own weight into dense layers, Daniel began studying snow properties with obsessive focus. He read everything he could find about Arctic exploration. Eskimos built houses from snow blocks. Those structures held weight and provided shelter. If snow could support a domed roof, it could support a tunnel ceiling, he thought, about distances. His cabin to the barn was 38 feet. Cabin to the woodpile was 22 feet. Cabin to the well was 45 feet. Those were the critical routes. The paths that became death traps in blizzard conditions. What if, before winter arrived, he prepared those routes? What if he built a door on the side of his cabin, positioned low where snow would drift naturally? What if, as winter progressed and snow accumulated, he carved tunnels through those drifts? Tunnels connecting cabin to barn, cabin to woodpile, cabin to well? He could move between structures without ever exposing himself to surface conditions. No wind, no visibility problems. No disorientation, just protected passages through the snow itself. The technical challenges were significant: how deep to dig, how to prevent collapse, how to ventilate, how to navigate in darkness. But these were engineering problems, and engineering problems had solutions. He made his decision in late May. He would test the concept next winter. He would build what he was already calling the side tunnel system. If it worked, he would never lose another partner to a 40-yard walk. He began preparing immediately. Summer brought long days and hard work. Daniel planted his crops and tended his cattle, but his real focus was preparation. He needed to modify his cabin before winter arrived, and the modifications would look strange to anyone who noticed. In late June, he cut a new opening in the side wall of his cabin. Not the front where the main door stood, but the north wall where snow drifted deepest during winter storms. The opening was unusual, only 4 feet high and 2.5 feet wide. He framed it carefully with salvaged lumber, creating a sturdy doorframe that sat just 18 inches above the floor level. William Kendrick rode over one afternoon in July and stared at the modification with obvious confusion. "What in God's name are you doing to your cabin?" William asked, adding a winter. "Door," Daniel said. "That's not a door, that's a crawl space. Nobody can walk through that. Don't need to walk. Need to access the snow." William shook his head. "You're talking nonsense, Cutler. That door opens to a wall of snow come December. Completely useless." "Maybe," Daniel said. He didn't explain further. Other neighbors noticed and questioned the strange door. Daniel gave vague answers about winter access and ventilation. Most decided he was eccentric but harmless. The door became a minor joke in the settlement. Cutler's tunnel door, Cutler's snow entrance. Nobody understood what he was planning. Through July and August, Daniel gathered tools. He reinforced 2 shovels with metal strapping, making them strong enough to cut through packed snow without breaking. He purchased a long-bladed saw in Yankton and modified it, adding a handle that would allow him to cut horizontally while crouching. He collected rope and marked it at 5-foot intervals for measuring distance in darkness. In September, he gathered logs, not firewood, but specific straight logs approximately 6 inches in diameter and 8 feet long. He cut and shaped 10 of them, peeling the bark and smoothing the surfaces. William Kendrick watched him work and asked what they were for. "Structural support," Daniel said. "For what?" "Winter project." "You're being mysterious as hell, Cutler. You'll see come February." Daniel stored the logs near his cabin, spacing them along the routes he had planned. 3 logs near the path to the barn, 2 near the woodpile route, 3 more between cabin and well. To anyone else, they looked like randomly placed timber. To Daniel, they were precisely positioned components of his tunnel system. He measured distances carefully. Cabin side door to barn door was 38 feet, accounting for the angle. Cabin to woodpile was 22 feet. Cabin to well was 45 feet. He drove small stakes into the ground, marking these routes, then removed them, before anyone could ask questions. By October, his preparations were complete. The side door was functional. The tools were ready. The support logs were positioned. He had sketched rough plans showing tunnel dimensions and placement. Now he just needed snow. The first flakes fell on November 9th. Daniel watched from his window and felt something he hadn't felt since Matthew died. Not quite hope, but purpose. He would solve the problem that killed his partner, or he would fail trying. Either way, he wouldn't accept winter's cruelty as inevitable anymore. November brought steady snowfall. Not blizzard conditions, but consistent accumulation. 6 inches one day. 4 inches 2 days later. 8 inches the following week. By mid-November, Daniel had 18 inches of base snow covering his property, and the drifts against his cabin's north wall were already 3 feet deep. He began excavating on November 16th. The first tunnel would connect his cabin side door to the woodpile, 22 feet away. Shortest distance. Simplest test of the concept. If this failed, he would know before investing more time. He opened his side door and faced a wall of packed snow. Perfect. He grabbed his reinforced shovel and began cutting into the drift. The snow resisted but yielded to steady pressure. He carved blocks roughly 12 inches square and stacked them outside the tunnel entrance. The initial passage was crude, only 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, barely enough room to crawl through on hands and knees. But Daniel wasn't building for comfort. He was building for function. A crawl space that protected him from surface conditions was infinitely better than walking exposed through a blizzard. He worked methodically, cut snow blocks, removed them, smoothed the walls, shaped the ceiling into a gentle arch. The arched shape was critical. He remembered from his mining days that arched ceilings distributed weight better than flat ones. The principle worked in rock. It should work in compacted snow. After 5 feet of progress, he stopped and retrieved one of his prepared logs. He positioned it horizontally across the tunnel entrance, embedding the ends into the snow walls on either side. The log served as a lintel, bearing the weight of snow above the opening. He packed snow around it until it was solidly anchored. The work was exhausting. Crawling in confined space, cutting and moving snow, maintaining constant awareness of structural stability. He worked 2 hours, rested 1 hour, worked 2 more. By evening of the first day, he had excavated 12 feet of tunnel. The second day brought more snow, 3 inches overnight. Good. More material to work with. Daniel continued excavating, extending the tunnel toward the woodpile. He used his marked rope to track distance. At 18 feet, he adjusted his angle slightly, correcting his direction based on measurements he had taken before winter. 20 hours of work over 2 days brought him to the woodpile. He broke through the final section and found himself in the small, sheltered area beside his stacked wood. Success. He carved a small chamber at the tunnel's end. 4 feet wide, 5 feet long, tall enough to kneel in. Room to stack firewood and turn around. He tested the complete system that evening, entered through his cabin side door, crawled through 22 feet of tunnel, retrieved an armload of wood, crawled back, emerged in his cabin. Total time, 4 minutes. 0 exposure to surface wind or cold. William Kendrick rode over the next morning and found Daniel's property covered in piles of excavated snow blocks. "What the hell have you been doing, Cutler?" "Digging," Daniel said. "Digging what?" "Holes." William stared at the snow piles, at the strange low door, at Daniel's snow-covered clothes. "You're digging tunnels through the snow." "Yes, like a damn prairie dog." "If it works," Daniel said. William shook his head and rode away, convinced his neighbor had lost his mind. Daniel ignored the mockery and continued building. The woodpile tunnel proved his concept worked. Now he needed the critical connections, cabin to barn, cabin to well, routes that would save lives when the real storms arrived. December brought heavier snow, 8 inches on December 2nd, 12 inches on December 7th. The base depth reached 4 feet across open ground. Drifts against structures climbed to 6 and 7 feet, perfect conditions for tunnel construction. The barn tunnel was more ambitious, 38 feet of distance. Daniel started excavating on December 9th. This time he built larger, 5 feet high, 3 feet wide. Enough room to move through without crawling. He could crouch walk through a passage this size while carrying supplies. He applied lessons learned from the woodpile tunnel. The arched ceiling remained essential. He shaped it carefully, creating a smooth curve that distributed weight evenly. Every 8 feet, he installed one of his horizontal support logs. The logs acted as lintels, reinforcing the tunnel ceiling and preventing collapse under the massive snow weight above. The barn tunnel took 6 days to complete. 60 feet of excavation when accounting for the slight curve he carved to avoid a low spot where snow might be less stable. He broke through near the barn side wall and created another small chamber. Room to stand. Space to work with livestock feed. A protected area where he could prepare before entering the barn itself. He tested it immediately. Cabin to barn through underground passage, no surface exposure, no wind. The tunnel walls actually felt warmer than outside air because the compacted snow provided insulation. He could navigate it in complete darkness using touch alone, trailing his hand along the wall. The well tunnel was the most critical and most dangerous, 45 feet of distance, and he would be working near water. If he miscalculated depth and broke through to the well shaft prematurely, the tunnel could flood or collapse. He spent 2 days planning before starting excavation, measured angles carefully, marked his route with stakes he could feel through the snow. Started digging on December 18th. This tunnel required constant adjustment. The well sat in a slight depression where snow accumulated in irregular patterns. Daniel had to angle downward for the first 20 feet, then level out, then angle slightly upward for the final approach. He installed support logs every 6 feet on this tunnel, not trusting the irregular snow layers. On December 23rd, he reached the well. He carved a chamber around the well head, creating a protected space where he could draw water without exposure. The chamber connected to his tunnel network, which connected to his cabin. He could now access water in any weather condition. By December 28th, his system was complete. 3 tunnels radiating from his cabin side door. Woodpile tunnel, 22 feet. Barn tunnel, 38 feet. Well tunnel, 45 feet. He had created a small junction chamber where the tunnels intersected, allowing navigation between any 2 destinations. Total construction time, 42 hours of hard labor spread across 6 weeks. William Kendrick visited again in early January and saw the network of snow block piles marking Daniel's excavations. "You really built them," William said. "The tunnels. Yes. You'll be buried alive when they collapse." "Maybe," Daniel said. "But I won't freeze walking to my barn." William rode away, shaking his head, certain Daniel Cutler had wasted his entire early winter on a death trap. January 1877 began with mild weather. Temperatures held in the 20s. Light snow every few days. Nothing severe. The kind of winter that made settlers forget how brutal Dakota Territory could be. The mild conditions intensified the mockery Daniel faced. William Kendrick stopped by in mid-January and gestured at the tunnel entrances visible around Daniel's property. "All that work for the mildest winter in 5 years," William said. "You wasted half your November and December digging holes that'll melt come March." "Maybe," Daniel said. "Could have spent that time cutting firewood, building proper storage. Anything useful." Other neighbors shared William's assessment. The tunnels became a settlement joke. Cutler's folly. Cutler's snow burrows. The strange project that proved Daniel had too much time and too little sense. Men laughed about it over drinks in Yankton. Wondered aloud if Daniel planned to hibernate like a bear in his underground passages. Daniel maintained the tunnels and said nothing. He checked them weekly, keeping the entrances clear of loose snow. He reinforced weak sections where settling had created small depressions in the ceiling. He added small notches in the walls at regular intervals, creating tactile markers he could feel in darkness for navigation. He noticed details others missed. The way his livestock acted nervous in their stalls. How the air pressure seemed wrong, creating a heaviness that made breathing feel labored. The strange color of the sky on clear days, a flat gray-white that looked nothing like normal winter skies. Old-timers in the settlement noticed too, men who had survived 15 or 20 Dakota winters. They didn't mock Daniel's tunnels. They prepared quietly, stocking extra supplies and reinforcing their structures. They recognized the signs. Something was coming. February 5th brought the first real indication. Wind shifted from northwest to northeast. Temperature dropped 15 degrees in 3 hours. Sky turned an ugly yellow-gray. Cattle refused to leave the barn even for feed. Birds disappeared completely. Daniel spent February 6th preparing. He used his barn tunnel to move extra hay into feeding positions where he could reach it easily. He carried 4 days' worth of firewood through the woodpile tunnel and stacked it. Inside his cabin, he filled every container he owned with water from the well tunnel. By evening, he had enough supplies inside his cabin to survive a week without leaving. William Kendrick did standard preparation. Brought in 2 days of firewood, filled 1 water bucket, fed his cattle and checked the barn door latch. Nothing special. Just normal storm prep for what he assumed would be a normal winter storm. February 7th dawned cold and still. No wind. Heavy gray sky pressing down like a weight. Temperature at 10 below zero by mid-morning. Then, at noon, the wind arrived. It started as a whisper. Within 20 minutes, it was howling. Within an hour, it was screaming. Snow began falling so thick that visibility dropped to nothing. Daniel watched from his cabin window as the world disappeared into white chaos. The blizzard of 1877 had arrived, and it would prove to be the worst storm Dakota Territory had ever seen. Daniel sealed his cabin's main door and waited. His side door remained accessible, and below the surface fury, his tunnels waited in silent darkness. The storm intensified through the afternoon and into the night. Wind speeds that Daniel had never experienced. He estimated 60 miles per hour based on how the cabin walls groaned under the pressure. Snow didn't fall so much as fly horizontally, driven by wind that made the air itself a weapon. Temperature plummeted. 20 below zero by evening, 30 below by midnight. The kind of cold that killed exposed skin in minutes. That turned breath to ice crystals before it left your lungs. That made steel brittle and wood crack. By morning of February 8th, 3 feet of new snow had accumulated. Drifts reached 12 feet against any vertical surface. The world above ground had become utterly impassable. Daniel looked out his frosted window and saw nothing but white chaos. He couldn't see his barn 38 feet away, couldn't see his woodpile 22 feet distant. The surface, the world had ceased to exist. But below the surface, his tunnels remained stable. At 8 o'clock that morning, Daniel opened his side door. Snow had drifted against it, but hadn't blocked it completely. He pushed through into his junction chamber and lit a small lantern. The tunnel system was intact, walls solid, ceiling holding. The wind howled above, but down here the air was still and relatively warm. Maybe 10 degrees, 50 degrees warmer than the surface. He navigated to the barn through complete darkness, counting steps and feeling wall markers. Emerged in the barn chamber. His cattle were agitated but alive. He fed them hay he had positioned the day before. Checked their water. Spent 20 minutes ensuring they would survive another day. Then he returned through the tunnel to his cabin. Total time outside his cabin, 35 minutes. Total exposure to surface conditions, 0 seconds. At William Kendrick's homestead half a mile west, the situation was desperate. William had 2 days of firewood inside his cabin, adequate for a normal storm. Not nearly enough for this. By the second day, February 9th, he was burning furniture to stay warm. His cattle in the barn were without feed. He could hear them bellowing, but he couldn't reach them. The barn was 45 feet from his cabin. It might as well have been 45 miles. He tried on the morning of February 10th, tied a rope around his waist, and anchored it to his door frame. Stepped into the blizzard and immediately lost all sense of direction. The wind knocked him sideways. Snow blinded him. Cold burned his face. He managed 10 feet before the rope went taut, and he crawled back to his door, half frozen from 90 seconds of exposure. His cattle died that day. He could hear them die, could do nothing to help them. Daniel used his tunnels throughout the storm. Accessed his barn twice daily. Retrieved firewood through the woodpile tunnel. Drew water from the well. Never exposed himself to surface conditions. His livestock stayed fed. His cabin stayed warm. He survived in relative comfort while his neighbors fought for their lives. The storm lasted 7 days. When it finally broke on February 14th, the settlement took stock of what winter had taken. The count was worse than anyone had imagined. The wind died on February 14th. 7 days of continuous blizzard conditions finally ended. Daniel opened his main cabin door to a landscape transformed beyond recognition. Snow everywhere, drifts 15 feet high in places. Structures buried to their roof lines. The world sculpted into shapes that bore no resemblance to the flat prairie that had existed a week earlier. He waded through chest-deep snow toward William Kendrick's place. The going was brutal. Snow had consolidated enough to bear his weight in some places, broke through to his waist in others. The half-mile journey took 90 minutes. He found William's cabin nearly buried. Smoke rising from the chimney meant William was alive, but barely. Daniel pounded on the door. William opened it, and Daniel barely recognized him. Face gaunt, eyes hollow, hands wrapped in cloth from frostbite damage. He had burned every piece of furniture except his bed. His cattle were dead. He had been without food for 3 days and was melting snow for water over what remained of his fire. "Cutler," William said. His voice was barely a whisper. "Come with me," Daniel said. "Can't make it back to your place. Too weak. You won't walk on the surface." Daniel helped William to his barn. The structure was half buried but accessible. Inside, the dead cattle lay frozen. Daniel moved to the barn's north wall and began digging through the snow that had accumulated there. William watched, confused and exhausted. 20 minutes of digging revealed what Daniel was looking for. His well tunnel had a branch he hadn't mentioned. He had extended it an extra 60 feet during late December, pushing it toward William's property. The tunnel ended 30 feet from William's barn. Daniel excavated the final distance in 40 minutes, breaking through into the barn. "Through here," Daniel said. William stared at the tunnel entrance. "You dug under the storm." "I dug before the storm." They traveled through the tunnel system. William could barely crouch walk, but the protected passage allowed him to move without fighting wind or deep snow. 30 minutes later, they emerged in Daniel's cabin. Warm, food available, safety. William recovered over the next 3 days. As his strength returned, other settlers began checking on neighbors. The final count was grim. 3 settlers dead, one from attempting to reach his barn and freezing 15 feet from the door. 2 others from hypothermia when their firewood ran out and they couldn't access more. Dozens of cattle and horses dead across the settlement, structures damaged by snow weight and wind. Daniel's homestead was untouched, livestock healthy, supplies intact, no losses. Word spread quickly. Cutler survived using his tunnels. Cutler's cattle lived while others died. Cutler's Fool Project had been the only thing that worked when the worst storm in territorial history hit. William Kendrick became the system's strongest advocate. He told everyone who would listen how the tunnels had saved his life, how Daniel had moved freely while everyone else was trapped, how the concept wasn't crazy after all. By late February, 12 homesteaders were asking Daniel for help building their own tunnel systems. The mockery had transformed overnight into desperate interest. Cutler's folly had become Cutler's genius, and men who had laughed now came asking to learn. Spring came late in 1877. Snow remained on the ground until early April. When it finally melted, the settlement rebuilt, replaced lost livestock, repaired damaged structures, buried the dead with simple markers in ground that had thawed enough to dig. Daniel spent March helping. Neighbors designed tunnel systems. William Kendrick built the most elaborate network, connecting his cabin to barn, well, woodpile, and even to his neighbor's property. Others built simpler versions, single tunnels to barns or critical supply areas. But the principle spread quickly. Side doors positioned where snow drifted naturally. Support logs for structural integrity. Networks planned before winter arrived. The technique evolved as others adapted it. Some settlers built permanent wooden frames they could fill with snow. Others developed better lighting systems for tunnel navigation. A few experimented with ventilation shafts that reached the surface. Each variation improved on Daniel's original concept, but the core idea remained the same: travel through the snow, not over it. By the winter of 1878, 42 homesteads in the region had side tunnel systems. The winter was mild, which led some to abandon maintenance. But those who kept their tunnels functional found them useful even in moderate storms. Protected access to livestock and supplies without exposure. Winter mortality from exposure dropped dramatically. Over the next 15 years, territorial records showed the change. In the decade before 1877, an average of 8 settlers per year died from exposure in the region. In the decade after, that number dropped to less than 2 per year. The tunnels worked, and they saved lives. Daniel never promoted himself. When newspapers from Yankton came asking about his innovation, he declined interviews. When territorial officials wanted to document the technique for homesteading guides, he referred them to William Kendrick. He had solved the problem that killed Matthew Carver. That was enough. He married in 1879. A woman named Sarah from Minnesota who understood frontier life and didn't mind a husband who spent his winters maintaining snow tunnels. They had 2 children, a son in 1881 and a daughter in 1883. Daniel taught them both how to navigate the tunnels by touch in complete darkness. Skills for survival. The phrase Cutler Tunnel entered common usage across Dakota Territory. Other regions adopted variations. Minnesota settlers built similar systems. Montana homesteaders experimented with permanent underground passages. The innovation spread organically because it solved a real problem that killed real people. Daniel died in January 1892 from pneumonia. He was 53 years old. The settlement buried him next to Matthew Carver in the small cemetery 3 miles south of Yankton. His marker was simple: name, dates, nothing about tunnels or innovation. Just another settler who had lived and died on the northern plains. But that winter, when the first major blizzard arrived in late February, 40 families across the territory survived using tunnel systems derived from Daniel's design. They moved through darkness beneath the surface, chaos, fed their livestock, retrieved their firewood, drew their water, survived because one man had refused to accept that 40 yards should be a death sentence. The tunnels remained long after Daniel was gone, silent passages beneath the snow, built not for glory, but for survival. Standing testament to what necessity and careful thought could accomplish on the American frontier.